Hi, I'm Carl and welcome to my shop. So today we're going to be discussing some tips and tricks for sharpening a European longsword. A while ago I got into test cutting in historical European martial arts, and if you get into test cutting, you're going to find yourself at least a little bit interested in sharpening. I got very interested. I started doing research on sharpening knives and tools as well as swords, and in addition to that I started doing my own testing. Using a electronic microscope and looking at the changes left on the edge of a sword, using various techniques and trying different abrasives. Additionally, I would take finished edges and do destructive testing by cutting into cardboard or wood or, of course, tatami. I learned a lot during that process, and this video is to relay some of those tricks. The process that we're going to go through itself is the same one that Mike Edelson recommends, and he has a wonderful video that can be found on YouTube, and I'll link in the description below, that explains his process in close detail. I'm going to be touching on what the steps are, but I won't go into as much detail, so this should be considered an amendment to that and not a replacement. So, when I say edge, what I am referring to is the portion of the cross-section taper where I am removing material. And we have some objectives that we want to reach on that edge, that being that we want a good angle on both sides of that edge, what we will refer to as the foundation bevel. We want to make sure that that edge is extremely well polished as we can. Additionally, we want to make sure that the edge is free of defects, that being any kind of waving or wobbling, or any dips running in profile. And finally, we want to get the edge to have a good amount of durability. We want excellent edge retention so that we can cut more than one tatami before we sharpen, right? So, what are some materials that we're going to need? We're going to need a slack belt grinder. We're going to need some belts. We're going to need some buffing compound. We're going to need an angle guide. We're going to need a wood block. And alternatively, we can use some notebook paper to kind of test our edge. So let's go through these. Slack belt grinder, we have a couple of notes on this. One, there are some people that think that using any kind of mechanical device to sharpen an edge is going to anneal or ruin some amount of the temper. This is not true. So I have done testing where I've taken pieces of metal, such as this steel plate, and held it in one place on various abrasive materials for a prolonged period of time to see at what point there was color changes that indicate annealing, or the heat, as recorded on the infrared thermometer, got up to a point where I would be concerned that there would be temper loss. And it does occur. Takes about 30 to 45 seconds keeping the sword in one place before it will get up to a heat where you may have to worry about that. Steel is a good thermoconductor, however, and we are moving our edge back and forth along whatever we are trying to sharpen. And when tested in such a way, I have sharpened this piece of steel. The temperature only got about 1 degree Celsius higher on this edge that I have sharpened. So we're not worried about temper loss. It's not going to occur in traditional sharpening methods. And if you're holding in one spot for an extremely prolonged period of time, you're going to have the bigger concern that you have left a huge grind spot in your sword anyway. So, moving on from that, some notes on safety. You will notice that I've taken the sneeze guard off, I've taken the back plate off. That's because I find them inconvenient, and I don't feel particularly unsafe this way. Additionally, you'll see me sharpening without gloves on. That's because I want to feel where the edge is, and I'm not clumsy. If any of that makes you feel unsafe, use safety gear. Leave the sneeze guard on, put the black back plate back on before you turn it on. Wear gloves, but if you do wear gloves, I highly recommend that you get cut-proof gloves. So, for an example, here I have some boot leather. Here I have a sharpened sword. The boot leather stands no resistance to a sharpened sword. Leather cuts easily, so get good stuff that you won't have to worry about just shearing right open. Additionally, you'll see that there is, since we have no sneeze guard off, material will eject it at the top. So wear eyeglasses, and while nothing here has any carcinogens that I'm aware of, if you don't wear a dust mask, you will end up with gray skin. So safety is on you. Just, don't sue me. Moving on to belts. The way these function is the slack belt grinder will make them rotate. While they are rotating, they will strike the work surface with the abrasive, and the abrasive will act as though it is being hit by millions of little tiny chisels and hammers, and that abrasive will cut little troughs into the edge and powderize what material was there. So a couple of things on that. We'll need to go from whatever our coarsest abrasive is to a finer abrasive, and the coarser abrasive will make larger troughs down to a finer amount, and the finest abrasive would take forever to do the same work as a coarser abrasive, right? So we're going to need multiple coarsenesses. Additionally, there are various materials that you can select. There are some that I recommend you do not. This is an example of one I think you should not select. This is kind of a traditional mineral belt. And this one's zirconia, but they're all pretty much the same. Somebody has taken some mineral, crushed it up into a bunch of chips or powder of some grit size, and randomly adhered it to the belt. Because the chips are not necessarily uniform in size or shape, they're just roughly uniform. There are chances that some chips will dig further into the blade than others. There's the chance that it may cut outside of where your edge bevel is and mar the blade itself, and there's the chance that some may cut through the edge itself. And regardless, some troughs will be deeper than their neighbors, and therefore you will have to spend more time at successive belts trying to clear up the leavings of a ununiform particle. So just don't use this. An acceptable belt would be aluminum oxide. The particles are randomly arranged. They don't last forever, and as they wear, there can be some ununiformities develop, leading to the same trough issue where some cut mark is larger than another. But generally, they're okay. We also have stuff like a silicon carbide belt. These are pretty neat. The particles are super duper hard and such a fineness that they can actually be used to remove cut marks. And so if you want to use these, I would suggest that you use them before you go to your polishing stages. They will remove material quickly, so we have to be rather careful with them. Now, on to belts I do recommend. I recommend you get 3M Trizact belts. These are aluminum oxide, but they are set up in a very pyramid fashion. It's uniform all the way throughout the belt. They cut at a consistent rate. They seem to last forever. They do an excellent job. The cut marks are consistent, and they're well worth the additional expense. After we get done with our cutting belts, we will need to go to a polishing stage, and this is to remove the cut marks from the edge itself. Here you will notice that I have a leather belt, and it is dirty. That is because I have been using buffing compound or polishing compound of some form. This is super important. Why is this super important? So, the abrasive material from the belts leave cut marks. Those cut marks are still on the edge, even if you cannot see them. And they are very, very small, very minor cut marks. And what they are doing there is they're, in a very small way, serrating this edge. Okay? Because they are serrating this edge, if I pull cut, the paper does a perfectly acceptable job of getting cut, right? The sword will usually cut right through it. However, that's not the action that we take when cutting tatami. When we cut tatami, we are bringing the tip forward and we are directly impacting the tatami. So if I take a sword that has not been polished, such as this, that we use for winding and binding, and I should explain that. So since we're using this in winding and binding, I have put a good angle on it so that it can impact a sword and bite, but I have not polished it. So if I take this sword that has not been polished and I try to come down in a cleaving fashion, it will rip more than it will cut, right? In fact, that didn't cut at all. Now, by contrast, if I take a sword that has been highly polished and I come down with a direct impact, we have no problems cutting. The reason why that is the case is because when you have those mini serrations, it actually binds into the material that you're trying to cut. And so if I try to cut with that sword and then I look under a microscope, I'll see little pieces of paper all throughout those little serrations. And when I do so with a highly polished edge, there's no traces of the paper left whatsoever. And that's because there is no serrations for them to get caught in. Well, when we cut tatami, we don't want it to get bound up into the tatami either. So we want to highly polish all of those marks out and make sure that we have a good, smooth surface for our edge to be able to hew and not just, pull cut or draw cut. We don't want it to saw through the material, we want it to chop. All right. Moving on, we will also be making an angle guide. This is just a 20-degree angle cut into a block of wood. 20 plus 20 makes 40, so that's what we're going for. We're going to be going for a 40-degree edge bevel. So you'll notice that I have put a cut about 1/4 of the way down the block. This is so that I can take the angle guide and do this. Now, for the angle guide itself, we will not want to ride our sword on this. We will want to use this as a visual guide so that we know where our sword is. Trying to make some kind of mechanical means to pull the sword back and forth or like keep the angle in line, I think will just leave you with one more thing that can go wrong, and it will probably do you more harm than it does good. So I'd highly recommend to just not do that. What we will do is we will lay our sword on here, we will check our angle, and then we will lift off, and then we will begin the good work of sharpening. Additionally, we have a wood block. The wood block is to clean off the edge of the sword. So between each of our belts, we are going to take the wood block, we're going to put our sword on it, and we are going to pull down the edge. This is soft pine, this is hard steel. This does not actually hurt anything. Okay, what it does do is it takes off all of the folded steel that happens when we're in our cutting process, or the polishing compounds that will be left on the sword during the polishing process, or any dust from the steel or whatever, right? Any detritus left on the blade, it will knock all of that off. And this gets us to do a very good trick. This allows us, between each of our stages of sharpening, to hold the sword up into a light source and see if we see any flashing head on to the edge. If we see any flashing, that is the result of there being some kind of break in the edge, where it's instead of a narrow edge, there is a break, or some kind of folding, or some other kind of miscellaneous issue with the edge. If we see an issue like that, then we really need to just bring it back to the coarses grit and get that foundation bevel reestablished. So what's our process itself? We will take our coarses belt, we will put it on our select belt grinder, we will set our sword onto the angle guide, check our angle. We will begin moving slowly and then lightly touch our belt while using our body to rock back and forth. We will flip the sword, we will check our angle, and we will do the same thing. Some things to note is that, one, I want to make sure that the sword is in motion before I touch it. This is similar to spray paint, right? You don't want to hold the spray paint out and then spray. You want to make sure you're in motion before you spray, otherwise you'll apply too much material to your work surface. It's exactly the same thing with the sword. You want to make sure that the sword is in motion before you touch the belt because you do not want to remove too much material from one place, all right? Same when you are leaving. Now I bring my edge all the way to the end and let it fall off, but if you are bringing it before you get to the tip because you're worried about changing the bevel of the tip, then you will want to lift off while you are still in motion. Similarly, if you are going to go back and forth, then you want to slide all the way to where you want to change direction, lift off, and then start moving the other direction and reapply. You don't want there to be a period of deceleration and acceleration in one place on the blade. Okay, so now that we have gone through one side, we will get to the other side of our grinder, and we will proceed with the exact same thing. Check our angle, lift off, touch the blade using our body because there are linkages in our arms that will cause us to change our angle if we try to just do this with our arms. So we're going to try to lean forward and backwards as we do this procedure. From the other side, then we flip to the last side of the last edge, do the exact same procedure. So we end up doing one side of one edge, one side of the other edge, flipping to the other side of the grinder, doing the other side of that edge, and then the other side of our fourth edge. Right? Okay, so that's the procedure called, I will refer to as one pass. All right? So once we have done a few passes at our coarsest belt, we can then take our wood block, run it along our sword, check it in a light source, see if we see any flashing. If we do not see any flashing, then we are ready to proceed to our next belt. If we do see flashing, we go back to our foundation bevel creating belt, which is our coarsest belt. So if at 80 I see no flashing, I'll move on to 45. When I move from a coarser belt to a finer belt, I need to take more time with each successive belt. Now, from the coarsest belt, it may take quite a long time to establish a foundation bevel, so that's kind of an exception. But usually what I do is, at 45, I'll do 1 or 2 passes. At 30, I will do 3 or 4 passes. At 16, I might do 3 to 5 passes. And at 6, I will probably do 7 or so passes. The reason why I have to do more and more passes with each successive belt is the amount of cutting time it takes to cut out a larger cut mark, right? So take more time with each of your successive belts. So every time we go through a belt and we've done a few passes, we're going to be checking on the wood block and checking in the light source. If any of those passes results in seeing flashing in the sword edge, we're going to want to go back to 80 and make sure that our foundation bevel is correct. It is entirely possible that you could get all the way to 16 and you could look in a light source and you would see a big chip. If that happens, we want to go back to 80 to start removing large amounts of material again and not sit at 16. You can remove material at 16 or any of the belts, but because the coarseness is so fine, it will take you forever. It's better for you to go back to 80 and do a pass, and then 45 and do 2 passes, and then 30 and do 3 passes, and 16 and do 4, than for you to sit at like A6 all day trying to do the same amount of work. So we get all the way through to A6. On A6, we're going to do the exact same thing. We're going to do several passes with light pressure, and then we could continue on to our leather belt. What would happen if we did? If we did, we would end up with this perfect 40-degree angle that is super duper sharp and super awesome, right? No. If we did, we would end up more like we have something that looks kind of like this. There would be this super duper fine 40-degree tip with this little thing hanging off the end. And at most of the angles, that appears to be the case if we don't change our angle in some manner. We end up with a very fine tip that's kind of hanging off and wobbles throughout the edge of the blade and appears to be very sharp. Cuts paper well, cuts tatami well, doesn't get removed from the wood block, but isn't at all durable. And that very fine point will cut tatami a few times, and then eventually something will, be out of line and it'll break off or bend over, and then we're left with a dull sword. So I started looking at some other techniques to fix that, right? And you can use you can create secondary bevels and tertiary bevels and stuff, and it's super neat, and it served exactly what I wanted, but it required you to be very focused on what the angles are that you're trying to hit, and hitting them for the exact same duration with particular coarsenesses, and really looking under a microscope and trying to figure out if your angle's correct and all this stuff. And that takes a lot of time and takes a lot of energy, and I'm not smart enough for all that. I want to keep it simple, stupid. I want to use the KISS principle. So what do? When I get down to A6, after I have trimmed off the edge grind, the cut marks off of the 16, I will then do 2, maybe 3 passes with hard pressure on the belt. So what this is going to do is it's going to change the angle of the belt by roughly 10 degrees. This is a slack belt grinder. Any amount of pressure you put in is going to be relayed into what the angle of the belt does, right? So we're going to put hard pressure. So now, instead of hitting at 20 degrees, I am exiting at more like 30 degrees, and I am entering at more like 10 degrees. This is pretty interesting. So if you do this, about 2 or 3 passes at 6 micron belt, it almost creates a little tiny section of 30 degrees and a little tiny section of 10 degrees, and then your major section of your foundation bevel that is your good 20 degrees, right? So you've almost added a secondary and a tertiary bevel. Don't do it more than 3 times. 3 passes through the slack belt grinder, because you get a law of diminishing returns, and you want to make sure that that little tiny 60-degree bevel is not too much of the blade, but that's where you're going to get your durability. So now when we look down the edge of the blade, we see that the line becomes completely sharp and crisp, with nothing that looks deformed. When we look at it in the side, we can see in reflections off of the LEDs from the electronic microscope that there is a difference in the curve, and the durability is greatly enhanced. And let me show you what I mean. So this is my most simple way that I did destructive testing. I would take a sword, which I cringe a little every time I use the Alexandria for this, but I'll take the wood block, take the sword, and I'll hit it, all right? Leaving a large cut in the wood. If the edge is not durable, then we'll see it when we do something like test cut paper, right? No problems, wasn't catching on anything. No problems. Trying to lie to me. There we go. Yeah. So, hitting hard onto the wood block did no significant damage to the edge, and that's what we want. We want to be able to hit Not surfaces as hard as steel, but surfaces like wood, tatami, which is just wet grass, paper, etc., without having it bend over some very thin piece of steel. And that's what's achieved by changing those angles. All right. So we run it through the wood block after we're done our 2 or 3 passes with that hard pressure, and then we have to. We really must not forget about our polishing. So we take out our last cutting belt, and we put in our polishing belt suede side out. So get our polishing belt in place. We do much the same thing. We check our angle, we lift off, and we're going to want to vary our pressures with the leather belt, because we now have some rounding to the edge, and we want to try to get as much of those cut marks out as possible. Now, how many passes do we do? We basically do it until we're bored. I do about 12 passes with the suede side out, and we're using the suede side so that it'll gather more buffing compound. So every 3 or 4 passes, we're going to go ahead and just, while it's on, touch with the buffing compound to reapply some more, and we do about 12 passes, or until we get bored. It's you're no longer cutting. The material isn't going to be removing a lot of stuff, right? Not much material is going to be removed from your work product, so you can just keep doing it. When we get bored, we switch out our leather belt to the patent leather side, and we repeat the exact same process again. So we put more buffing compound on, we go through several passes. At about 3 or 4, we apply more buffing compound until we get to at least 12. And then we clean off our edge and we look in a light source. We make sure that everything's still looking good. And if it's still looking good, then we can take out, some paper, and we can do our test cutting and make sure that, it does not just pull cuts, but there you go, hues as well. And if it's still good, if it's good and sharp, we won't have any problems, and you'll have your sharp sword. So that's it really. Those are the tips. One is, of course, that we have discovered that there's not going to be any annealing damage. Then there's some suggestions on what kind of belts you should use, which is the same recommendation that Mike Edelson did. More emphasis on polishing and using a buffing compound for that. The use of a wood block in your testing and in your ability to clean the sword. Use of both sides of the polishing belt, and the changing in pressure so that you can increase your edge durability. That pretty much sums it up. That's our improvements. That's our tips and tricks. So I hope you found this video informative, and I look forward to seeing you guys at the next competition with your new and improved sharpening techniques. Let's see how you do. Thanks, guys. Cheers.